Isn't the class issue as well an identity issue, that I identify myself as member of the working class or bourgeoisie or whatsoever?
Later, together with identity politics, they always put their identity in big letters. But as you know, dialectical, the more you speak about something, the more the contrary is happening.
Politicians don't think anymore. Students don't think anymore, and nobody thinks anymore because we have digitalization and we have artificial intelligence. Yeah, welcome, Mehmet Okyayuz from Ankara.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to this conversation.
It's the second in a new project, if you want, from our group, Human Rights Universal and Global. And you are one of the founding members, if you want, of this group. Now, can you tell us a little bit about your personal background?
Yes, I try to make it relatively short. I grew up in Germany in the beginning of the 60s. My father, who was a medicine, migrated to Germany because of personal reasons. He decided to stay. And from 1961, approximately, I think, when I was 2 years old, until 95, I lived and I grew up and lived in Germany, and all my school years, school education, university education, and part of my professional education, professional issues started in Germany. Then in 95, I decided to return to Turkey, my homeland. And since then, I'm in Ankara, Middle East Technical University, Department of Political Science, and I'm teaching theory, political thought, social policy, ideology, migration, etc. So these are my teaching and research areas, I can say.
A little bit surprised that you say you moved to Germany, or in a way you had been moved to Germany.
I had been.
You did move yourself, and then you say you returned to your homeland. Isn't that a contradiction or something like that?
Yes, it's maybe if we are looking to the general tendencies, it is a little bit, it seems to be a contradiction, and it is also not representing the generality. It is a little bit an exceptional situation. But since I was in high school, in gymnasium, I had the understanding that I wanted to return, because we can speak maybe a little bit later about this, because I always had the feeling, even if I was objectively integrated, I went to gymnasium, I speak fluently English, etc. I always had the feeling, we can speak about that something is missing. What does not mean that everything is okay here, because here, as we can discuss, a lot of things are also missing. But I have had the feeling that I wanted to return to something like normality, maybe. So this was my decision. And despite all the political difficulties, and also material difficulties, which I had to face and have to face, I never regretted it. It's also interesting. So it was a little bit an anti-cyclic decision of myself.
You grew up in Germany in a Jewish family, and we talked about it earlier. You had not been the typical guest worker, as it had been called, but more or less privileged situation, family situation.
Yes. We can say class-wise, maybe. As I said, my father was medicine. He finished his studies in Turkey, studying medicine. Then I think he came to Germany with a scholarship or something like this. And in the beginning, he didn't want to stay, but in the beginning of the 1960s, for whatever reason, he decided to stay. But I grew up with the classical labor migrants, which also began to migrate to the industrial countries in the beginning of the 60s. So most of my friends and also the friends of my family came from this classical group of labor migrants who were recruited for working in the industrial sectors in Germany. This is maybe a difference. If I would have stayed in Turkey, this wouldn't be possible, I think. I would be much more in my own group, let's say, in my own class group, which was different in Germany.
But
different experience.
But for your parents, it had been okay.
What? I didn't understand, Peter.
For your parents, it had been okay that you, in a way, you left their class moving to the working class.
Yes, because my parents themselves, the friends of our family, because I grew up inside these people coming to work, and most of our family friends. Our family was a very, how can we say, situation nearly every evening, I have to say. We had families guests at home, and they also were workers' families, so this was no problem. This was totally an automatic, somehow organic situation in which I grew inside in Germany. This was never a question from no point.
In which city was it?
It was in the beginning, my father moved to northern Germany, Osnabrück, Wattenscheid, which is in the north. And then with 1964, I think, 1964, my father moved to southwest Germany, to Schwäbisch Gmünd, a middle-sized city in Baden-Württemberg. And when I was 14, 15, we moved to Böblingen, an industrial city near Stuttgart, the capital of Baden-Württemberg. But here, later, if you want, I can go into the reasons why my father had to move from Schwäbisch Gmünd, where he worked in a hospital, to Böblingen in this time. This had also certain reasons.
Well, I'm asking because I had been growing up as well during these years in a small town, large village, something like this. And there I would have said everybody would have been happy not to be in touch with the so-called guest workers, because it was a huge discrimination. It was appalling, really, what was expected from them to accept.
Yes. But don't forget, Peter, I'm from Turkey, so this point which you said, I experienced the prejudices when I was very small, and it comes to my mind now. But of course, because I'm from Turkey, we were in touch with our Turkish friends and people from my country, not only with them. Interestingly, in these years, we also had a lot of friends and family friends from Italy, later from former Yugoslavia, from Spain. So I grew up, interestingly, and I think this is a sort of was a chance for me a little bit, inside a very, very international environment. This has also something to do with later Böblingen, because Böblingen is a city where neighbored with Sindelfingen, and in Sindelfingen we have this Mercedes Fabrik, where I worked in the semester holidays, and there we have it was an industrial city. So from this point of view, having relations with working class people was very normal. Also in my school years, until I went to gymnasium, most of my friends came from were working class people who shaped my mind later. I think about this, who shaped my mind very much these years, I think.
Well, you just mentioned colleagues, friends from Yugoslavia, from Spain, from Italy.
Yes.
These had been the guest workers, the typical.
Yes, the guest workers.
There was a German contract or treaty with the government, people into Germany, and asking them basically to move away after 2 years or something, which never happened. But this entire topic brings me to this question of universal human rights, and the question of universal character of rights, or even this you said growing up in a kind of global environment with
in this years,
different countries. But And this is a little bit looking back and looking at what is going today. You have the good foreigners and you have the bad foreigners. This discrimination, and I think this in this way it's interesting. I worked in Arbeiterwohlfahrt Working Welfare Association, where we actually had been looking. It was the Turkish people and from Yugoslavia. So it was always this tension of, we have to do something for you because you cannot cope on yourself, on your own. And this, I think, is interesting that you then say, I felt inclined to go with my people on the national basis as well. Class.
No, I think not only because half of my friends were also German, so I grew really up very, let's say, binational or bicultural or multicultural. But Peter, to one word to this global thing, the global elements, let's say this universalism of living together with different people from different countries was established by us, by ourselves, because in the general society, I did not have the feeling, even when I was very young, I didn't have the feeling that this sort of global living together was really established. It was something what we did personally in our background. And the other thing was the prejudices. When I lived, there was not a clear distinction. So not only people from different countries were not so much liked, also, especially in my situation, we had a class situation, because when I was in the Volksschule, I mean, this was called Volksschule in the 60s, there were a lot of pupils from the working class, and the distinction, the separation between human beings was at the same time, and this was a sort of confusion, was not only ethnically based by the German majority population, it was also clearly class-based. This is what I experienced, two things at the same time. Because when I later went to the gymnasium, and Germany, as you know, is very hierarchical concerning education and very strict. When I went to the gymnasium, most of my German friends were 90% from the working class. They made a Berufsausbildung, a professional education. So in my mind, when I was a little child, ethnical things and class aspects, they were intermingled very much in these years, I think.
And you did not drive a Mercedes-Benz, or your parents did not drive a Mercedes-Benz?
No, but the workers in Sindelfingen, I mean, Mercedes-Benz in the region where I grew up was not a privileged car, because in Sindelfingen, this big Fabrik in Sindelfingen, the workers had Jahreswagen. Most of the workers we knew, German or Turkish or Spanish, whatever, who worked in the Fabrik, they drove Mercedes cars. No. So Mercedes was not in my region, in Sindelfingen, Böblingen, in this automotive region, was not a luxury car. I don't know how it was in your city or whatever, but here it was normal. It was not luxurious.
Yeah, well, in my city it was only for the privileged people, or for some people who needed it for professional reasons or whatsoever. But actually, when I later moved to Ireland, somebody said, "And you have a Mercedes-Benz."
Yeah,
the typical for German, and this is a little bit as well the question about prejudices and judgments. If you are, then you have to drive a Mercedes-Benz, then you have to be blah blah blah. And I think what you said so far is exactly this tension between, yes, there is this, in a way, clear class division, and at the same time there is something blurring where, yes, as worker in certain area you can drive a Mercedes-Benz, a luxury car, at the time at least, and. So what brought you actually then to, I think, to a clear position in terms of class? This is the decisive thing.
Yes, this was exactly the time, as I said, when first I have to say, and you know it too, the years when I grew up, when I went to the Volksschule was 64 or 65. Later, Gymnasium, beginning of the 70s, it was already the time when the so-called 68 generation teachers came to the schools. It was a little bit coincidence because most of my teachers, which I had in school, in both cities, Schwäbisch Gmünd and Böblingen, were somehow 68 people. And I was very much influenced by them structurally. The situation was a little bit a sort of enlightened situation. On the other side, I felt and saw that most of my Volksschule friends, most of my old friends, which I had from 6 to 10, did not go to the gymnasium. So that was poor, that was feeling, instinct, plus this again general political environment, which made me very, very, we can say, sensitive. This was the first thing which came in my mind when I go to the gymnasium, where are all my old friends? And this was something which was a class situation and not a situation, of course, indirectly, yes. But for me, my feeling was the class perspective developed very, very, very early in this time in my mind. And I think this has shaped, this was the beginning of a shapement of my general mind, I think, when I think about the past.
And 68 means what? How would you define this 68 generation?
68 generation, I think, especially in the universities, I think, not only 68, beginning with maybe also in the beginning of the 60s, I think a lot of questions about structural dimensions began to rise. I think now with my mind, I'm also teaching fascism. For example, the first time the structural problems of the bourgeois society began to be debated by relatively new scientists. Also, Eastern German and Western German academicians began to come together and to explore the relation with the bourgeois society. And in this atmosphere, I think, a new generation also in pedagogics and all these things, a new generation of people began to be educated and left the universities. And then they came to the schools. Maybe it was my chance because in my biography, my school time was always relatively, let's say, open for debate, for discussion, and people with racist people, which we also had, were in a minority, or they could not openly articulate their mind, which is different nowadays. Nowadays, the debate is always every day about migration, and these things. These people in the time when I grew up were in a minority. I think this shaped a lot of things.
Right. At the same time, it had been the year, if I remember correctly, it had been a fascist as the chancellor in Germany, Kiesinger.
Yes.
It had been Pahlavi, I forgot how to pronounce it, Reza Pahlavi.
In Iran, yes.
Germany, and actually students protesting again. One had been killed, Berne ohne Sorge, on the streets by the police. It had been a time of radicalization. And if you say that there happened something in in terms of education as well, Ulrike Baader-Meinhof was confronted with this situation that actually nothing changed. And this was her radicalization, really, where it's drifted this away from the class, from a clear situation. You didn't mention actually the trade unions, which had been as well part of this movement. And it had been an international movement.
Yes.
In Paris and
can I say you something, Peter, in this context? Because some imaginations about people coming to work in Germany were destroyed in these years, because when the Turkish people were recruited, labor agreements were recruited, the Germans thought that the Turkish people are conservative, are not very much organized, and so they made agreements with Turkey. But the interesting thing is, and this also shaped our mind in these years, most of the Turkish people recruited very much, very fast. I have articles about this. So in the end of the 1960s, the conservative, determined workers from Turkey were much more organized in these years, even than the Turkish workers. And we have also, remember, maybe you have heard the September strikes, which was a famous strike movement, spontaneous strike 69. And on the front were the Turkish workers. And this was also a situation which was reflected in our home, because in our home later in the beginning of the 60s until beginning of the 70s until 75, I can remember very much that all the debates were very political, but not based on identities. So I can remember that everyone debated politically concerning Germany and Turkey. And this also was a situation where the class situation or the political framework came always to the foreground. This was the general atmosphere. I remember we had always political debates at home with the families we had, speaking of Turkey and of Germany. And in these years, we have still not a splitting in different native groups. One other anecdote, if I speak too much, Peter, say it, please. When I began to work in the semester holidays, I worked 2-3 times in Mercedes-Fabrik to earn money, because 6 weeks we worked on the belt, Fließband, and earned a lot of money. And in these years, all of the foreign workers, they met together, they spoke together, they organized together, they made common lists for the representative institutions in the Fabrik. There was no separation in different ethnicities. So later, beginning of the 90s, the problem of identity, ethnicity came to the foreground. But I had the chance, I think, when I was young and also a student, that I was not very much influenced by these ethnical, identical things. The class situation and the common solidarity was a much more important topic starting from my childhood, I would say. Not necessarily left or right, because we had also very right-winged family friends, but inside our family, and I observed as a young boy, etc., there were all very lively debates about, as I said, about politics. And they were not imprisoned into questions of ethnicity or something like this. I can remember very well.
Right, but isn't the class issue as well an identity issue, that I identify myself as member of the working class or bourgeoisie or whatsoever?
Yes, this is something, this is immanent to the problem, because as I said, my father is a Metziner, but our nearness to working class people and our certain traditions of thinking, which we had brought from Turkey, also made us very clear for us, also for my father, that we were not organized, or let's say organic people of the working class, but we always felt ourselves inside the group of people whose, let's say, very classical, whose surplus began to be exploited. So for us, it was always clear where we are standing, and this was the situation.
Well, isn't it interesting as well in terms of the segmentation, of certain segmentations, that you are, on the one hand, you are a member of a certain class, at the same time you are a member of a, let's say, you have a certain national background, and then you are, there's some attribution. If you are from, as I said, if you are from Germany, you have to be better off and you drive a Mercedes-Benz or any other luxurious car. If you are Turkish, whatever your profession is, you are one of those who are conservative in terms of mindset and extremist religion and religious. And we have this debate today as well, that you are put into a certain box and there you have to stay. Please don't leave.
Yes. Of course, I mean, what I told you until now was my own specific background, which came from outside and what we also created by ourselves. But as you said, the boxes and the boring questions and the prejudices never missed, not even in my life. So we, at the same time, we experience this this imagination of the foreigner, but as I said, this was still not a majority tendency, I have the feeling. So these bad people, let's say, really, they stayed still silent. Okay, politically, we have right-wing organizations, NPD, who tried to elaborate on the migration issue very early, but the majority of the population in these years seemed to be relatively anti, how can we say, not too much influenced by these prejudices. But nevertheless, in the we felt it more and more, I would say, starting with the midst of the 80s, when we have a general identity renaissance worldwide, religion, identity, ethnicity, this all started in the midst of the 80s to flourish. This also then influenced the people who came to work, and then this separation started, and they built their own boxes. But for the bureaucracy, for the politicians in the receiving countries like Germany, it was something positive because they declared identities from above. And if you say always to someone from above, you are this and this and this, that means if you make an essentialism, then in a certain point, the foreigners themselves, they took over the arguments and said, okay, if you say I'm this and this and this, I will accept it, but I will use it as a weapon against yourself. But this never was successful because the state is stronger than you. So this was the beginning of all these splittings, of all these things. Of course, remember, Peter, you also have to see beginning of the 80s means a general religious renaissance everywhere. We have not only the situation in Iran, in 80 we have the military coup in Turkey, and the collaboration with religious forces against the left started very early in these years. So we have something what we call identity politics, which wiped out a little bit all the things which I began to experience when I was a child and a student. This later really became erased, let's say, unfortunately. I can remember one point. I can remember in Heidelberg, we had Ausländerrat, you know, these Ausländerrat, that means a participatory mechanism and advisory boards of the foreigners. They have no right for any decision, but the mayor can take advice from them. Okay. Beginning of the 80s in Heidelberg, where I studied, we had mixed lists of different people independent from their ethnicity. And later, in the midst of the 80s, we have then national lists the first time. So Turkish lists, Italian lists. So this was also a result of this increasing identity politics together with the immigration policies in these countries. And I think this destroyed most of the things experienced concerning things, I think. But this is nationwide. This is not only the case for foreigners. This happened in general in the world in these years, we can say.
Well, I'm wondering, the identity politics in a negative perspective is the one thing, but I can as well say there is a positive aspect to it, that you mentioned Italian, Turkish, whichever group. And for instance, if I take Italy, we always have had a strong communist movement.
Yes.
Communist or whatsoever, but then you can say as well, not being able to be communist in Western Germany, because that was, even if you mentioned communism, that was already really bad enough to you couldn't expect anybody to talk to.
Yes.
So in this way, it could be a positive thing as well. I'm Italian, and we Italians, we are communists. We are Catholic, but we are communists.
One thing, Peter, do you know the history? In 55, The first country with bilateral agreements to recruit workers were Italians. Well, some of them work in the agricultural sector. And the Italians, as you said, had their working class experience. The Communist Party was the strongest in the West, etc. And as I said, this was the reason why later in 1961, the Germans decided to take people from Turkey. But as I said, their expectations were not fulfilled from our people because, as I said, they were organized in the contrast to what is known. So in migration, we have a lot of legends which are not happening, which are not true. Only something which I want to add. But I think the identity issue had never a positive. I didn't feel anything positive, I have to say, when these identity issues came to the foreground in my personal biography in Germany. I think this was more a splitting of common interests, I had the feeling. And together with this identity politics, the real identities began to be covered because I was always aware from where I come. I mean, my roots are clear. My roots were clear, but I remember we never presented our identity like with a poster. So I had never the feeling or the need to speak permanently about my roots, but I knew from where I came. This was the most, I can say, our generation, let's say it more global. I'm the second generation. The second generation people grew up much more healthy. They knew from where they were coming, but they didn't have to present it all the time. Later, together with identity politics, they always put their identity in big letters. But as you know, dialectical, the more you speak about something, the more the contrary is happening. It's like morality. The more people are speaking about morality, most of the time, the less moral they are, I think.
Can you say something like, we have had our identity and then the class identity or whatever, I knew from what you said, I knew from where I come, and that was instrumentalized from others,
totally.
I think, class or whatever, and they say kind of, yes, concentrate yourself on exactly this issue, even if it does not really matter.
I think, Peter, the German, when we speak of Germany, because immigration policy, the German authorities or politicians, they essentialized, what you mean? They essentialized natural forms of identities. I mean, everyone knows you cannot easily wipe out your identity. Think of the USA, Robert De Niro. He's an American, but he, of course, knows that he has Italian origin, but he does not put it on the poster all the time. But I think it was, as you said, it became to be instrumentalized, and it lost its positive aspects. Its positive drive were lost a little bit, and so it was an essentialization. And I felt I experienced this concerning religion. So later, if you came from Turkey, you had to be, in quotes, Muslim, for example. And I grew up in my environment. We had a very secular environment. The Turkey was, and this is something that people are not aware of, we had a lot of secular people. Religion in our home, not only from my family, in our Turkish community, was never debated, really not debated. It was not a topic. This all changed in the midst of the 80s. And this was used and functionalized, I think, by the authorities. They essentialized our identities.
Coming from there to the economy or to the economic questions, the so-called guest workers had been the servants, not to say the slaves of
yes, okay.
Class, and
like all the other workers too.
How people had been treated. I saw them in a small room living with 8 people, no washing possibilities, proper things like this. And then there was this kind of what we see now as well with China, with South Africa, with other areas, people, countries claiming their right of, yes, you are stronger at the moment in economic terms, you have the dominant position, but we question it actually. And I don't know in Turkey that is a certain movement as well, where it had been not simply accepting that we expected to serve, coming there to serve and then to leave, but we are people, we are human beings.
Yes.
As human beings, we have rights.
But one thing I have to say, what is a tragedy, as you said, this situation until the beginning of the 60s, it is what you said. Most of the people from these countries came as singles. Most of the time they had to sign that they are not married. They were cheap and tested workers, functional, and they were very productive. They lived in the Wohnheime. But starting with 67, 68, the family reunification came to the foreground. And one disaster for the European countries was they could not prevent it. Because in other countries like France, Holland too, this was a rotation. They get working permit for 1 year in the beginning and later for 2 years. But they were so productive in the beginning that the entrepreneurs demanded extension of their working and residence permits. And so they stayed and they took their families, and countries like Germany could not prevent it because we have international regulations, family, the protection of the family, etc., after World War II. And this is human rights, Peter. A lot of your regulations were established, also the ILO, etc. So the nation states could not do what they want. So the fact that we have now so much foreigners from the first guest worker generation is something which was never wanted. And this is something, I think this is a sort of offene Wunde, what you can say, to an open wound for the people, for the bureaucrats. They never, in fact, didn't want us, let's say. I'm a little bit emotional now. And exactly this, we didn't want you in the beginning. It happened only. This is something in my life and for my friends, this is something we began to experience very fast again in the mid-80s. I was in Heidelberg. Later, I was also teaching in Heidelberg University. And I remember I spoke about the German political system. And a student said to me, "Why do you speak about our German affairs? Don't do it. You have no right. You are a Turk." So these things began to happen. And so all the things which I positively told you began to be wiped out a little bit. And this happened as a bad experience. And identity politics was one of the tools this happened, which were functionalized in these years, I think. And I felt myself, when it comes to my own life, I more and more felt uncomfortable, even if I was materially in a good situation. I was privileged as a Turk, not in general, also as a German, because as you know, working class people nowadays can even less go to the universities than 30 years ago. The situation has become even worse in Germany than before. So it was a general problem. And in my mind, my ethnical thing came automatically to the foreground, which I didn't want it. But let's say they more and more attacked me. So my ethnical background, which was never important for me as such, became more and more important from the outside. So in these years, I began to think, and I wanted to establish something like normality, which of course is impossible, because people like ourselves are never living in normal situations somehow. But this was a sort of imagination. Please return. I never returned because of national reasons. I really returned because I wanted to go out of this exceptional situation, which I felt more and more as a foreigner this time. And then I wanted to do something positive in my country. This is really a leftist idealism, let's say. This was really the reason. Because for material reasons, I had to stay. Materially seen, it was a total regress because our income and all the things is not comparable with Germany. I knew this. Nevertheless, I didn't regret it.
Idealist materialist or materialist idealist?
I think this time materialist idealism, let's say. And as I said, this was the reason, this mixture, I was really put in a certain corner, I had the feeling. And in these years, a lot of friends too had the decision, but they had maybe not so much chance because you have to have chance. I applied for METU. They took me. I had chances. A lot of people also tried in these years to return, I remember, but some of them couldn't do it. They returned again. It's a little bit like it was not a typical back to the root situation, like in Africa, because a lot of Afro-Americans later tried to move to Africa because of other reasons, slavery. This is, of course, not in my case, but a lot of people did not succeed to integrate themselves into their home country. I did succeed somehow.
When did you move? Forgot this.
I moved 95. Now it's 30 years. I'm now nearly half of my life now, but still the majority of my life happened in Germany. Because from 2 to 35, I lived in Germany, and from 35 to 65, I'm now in Turkey. So I lived a longer time in Germany than I live now in Turkey, but nearly the same, half and half now.
Don't say to calculate where I live most of the time.
Yes, you also moved a lot. You also, as I know.
But I'm wondering, you moved back, or you moved to Turkey.
I don't know how to say it, moved back or...
HRUG had been a kind of, from what I know, having been there visiting, it's a very progressive university.
Still relatively progressive.
And so you moved in, I think one can say this, from an increasingly conservative Germany to, at that time, or even, as you say, still a very progressive environment, and an environment, if I look at the development of cities and this, it was kind of progressing.
Yes, I have to say, I have to say that still it's the case when we are speaking of human rights, for example. Still, there is a sort of progressivity in Turkey. I don't want to glorify my country, but there is still a portion of social progressivity in Turkey, which I think has been a little bit lost in Germany, despite the fact that Germany has this strong labor tradition, working class tradition. Even fascism could not destroy this sort of culture. Not even in Western Germany, we have still strong labor unions and so things, and we have only a little labor union in Turkey with 1.5 million members. But I think there is a sort of lost progressivity in Germany, and still a sort of increasing progressive, despite all the reactionary things which are happening in my country, which you know and which I experience. But there is still something ongoing which I miss in Germany, I have to say. Maybe we can later speak about the migration debate in Germany, which I find a little bit ridiculous, I have to say, from outside, from Turkey.
Anarchism? I'm wondering, you said the social progressive, and this is, I think, interesting, or especially interesting, talking about human rights. You have the institutional system, you have the rule of law and all these things in place. But at the same time, it's a kind of rigid, not moving anywhere system, which allows either conservatives or ultra-rights to move, because the rest is kind of mentally dead, to say it in a very provocative way. Whereas I'm always and again surprised if we talk, or if I talk to other Turkish colleagues. I can take another example actually from Italy. after the elections of Berlusconi, I met a friend in Brussels, and I said, well, Francesco, you are really nice people, but why did you elect this person again? And he said, we don't bother what he says or what he does. We do our own thing. And this reminds me a bit on what we talked occasionally. Okay, you have this authoritarian regime, which is extreme in a way, and it's going into a direction where it's getting more and more difficult to get out of it. But at the same time, you have people on the streets protesting.
Yes, and can I say something, Germany? In Germany, I have the feeling that progressivity now, and I'm looking every day to the German media, so a sort of progressivity in Germany is moving also forward, but on an institutional, political, and a little bit artificial level. But at the same time, we have this social conservative attitudes. I remember in Turkey, it's something from, it's different. In Turkey, we have this, how can we say, institutional reactionary politics, let's say, in difference to Germany, because in Germany, everything is politically from above determined. Because I was in Wiesbaden, I remember 2 years ago, and there in the park, there was a remark from the mayor, from the municipality. And it is written, in diesem Kindergarten ist kein Platz für Rassismus. In this playing place for children, there is no place for racism. This is what I meant with this progress, this is bureaucratic progressivity, which means nothing. But I mean, I find this ridiculous. It is ridiculous to put this shield to the place. Huh? So this happens on the one side, but on the other side, the mind of the people, the media people, the journalists, the debates are so reactionary on the other side. This is really, as you said, it's a sort of anachronism. And in Turkey, it's a little bit from the other side. Socially, we have a lot of awakenings sometimes, but institutionally, we have pressure. The question would be, what is better? I mean, we cannot compare it, but it's different. As I said, I find these remarks ridiculous. In this place or in this building, there is no place for racism. So what? You don't need to bring these shields to the walls of the houses. It is, I think, ridiculous, these things.
I was just looking, but I don't have that paper here in front of me, just working on legal issues and legal positivism, where you have many statements actually criticizing this legal positivism as it's soulless, there's no soul, there is no meaning in it, it's formally correct, and as Niklas Luhmann said, it's legitimation by procedure. If everything is correctly done, then we have everything is okay. But
I think it's exactly the point.
No consideration of justice. There's no consideration of meaning of what it is.
And
if Peter, the time is up, then we are
okay, exactly. And when I was little, what I described, because to speak of myself, the situation, as I said, was different. There seemed to be the first time, together with this renaissance of the 60s, with more egalitarian politics, etc., then it seemed to be that this legal positivism was a little bit wiped out, and this really something social began to happen in these years. This was something positive, and also the second generation of foreigners began to speak of themselves the first time. It was not so much spoken about them. They began to speak themselves the first time about their issues. I think this was a good time. In general, of course not. I mean, only as a tendency. But then, as you said, this legal positivism began to flourish, I think. And this is really not something real, I have the feeling. For example, but it is also what happens in the media. You know, this migration issue. When I look to the German TV every day, the most important topic is migration. Okay, I can understand the problems in the regions. Okay, we can understand it. But I think for such a rich country, really, speaking every day about migration, about putting it to the main issue, I really find this. Yes, I really find this inappropriate, and this happens every day, I would say, in the German TV. And the problem now is that in the European Union, a lot of so-called values are shifting away, because remember these front things, what happens with the new chancellor. So they will send back foreigners even if they apply for asylum and these things. And we spoke about this, Peter. I think now the other Germany becomes more and more dominant, because Germany, I have told it to you, think, for example, of Meloni. Meloni, for example, is a right-wing prime minister, okay, but she couldn't do a lot of things what she wanted to do because Italy is not so powerful, and etc. But when Germany begins to open certain doors, then the other countries will follow. So Germany is very important, and I think the things which are happening now are not so very. This is, I think, an antithesis to the egalitarian things which happened in the 60s, 70s, and mid 80s. I would say. I mean, to speak general, of course.
I was just reading today or yesterday an article from the United States, the big brother, and definitely more important than Germany, where
Yes.
people actually said these recent protests, and especially that they are using police and military forces to control them, have something positive, namely that people are becoming aware, and that they are not ready to accept that their rights are taken. And I was just in the morning, I crossed a European border going to Germany,
Yes.
and the police had been standing in the middle of the road. So you had to leave the road actually to pass the police car. And of course, they had been looking into the car or which way ever you traveled. And then later I talked to somebody in Germany who goes there every day to work. And she said, if I see them, I'm just put off. I can't cope with it, seeing it every day and give more and more. The controls are becoming stricter. So is there something that may turn things around, that you say, on the one hand, you have this strict, increasingly strict and helpless reactionary or conservative politics, and especially seeing that it doesn't work, we have to defend our old previous laws.
Yes. I understand you. I think you will say, I understand you will say, if something is sometimes openly done and articulated as a reactionary thesis, let's say, then it is possible to make an antithesis because you are openly confronted with things. Is that what you mean? Yes. And it is a potential of change then in itself, in a positive way. But I don't think that concerning migration, especially, I think, or the border controls, this won't happen because especially the media has so much prepared the ground in which people are inside that I think this turn will not happen. I'm not very positive about things. And don't forget the AfD, the party, is strong, and what to do with this?
Well, I wouldn't be really optimistic, but at the same time, and this is something where I simply try to find out what is going to happen there, that in the United States you have now industrial groups, agricultural representations of farmers saying, actually, we need them. You can't just turn them back.
Yes.
If you take the care system probably in most of the European countries, EU countries, you would not have any care.
This is true.
It's marginal what is left.
This is true.
So.
Yes, but somehow it's not. You are totally right. It would collapse. Some branches would collapse, but somehow it is not really reflected in the things that are happening. This has to be analyzed maybe, but I don't see it reflected in the general attitudes or general policies, I think. It's interesting, yes. Even if the people know that they are dependent on, for example, on these people in certain branches of care, etc.
Well, let's come to one different topic, or perhaps not so different topic at the end. Politicians don't, well, it's a very bold statement. Politicians don't think anymore. Students don't think anymore, and nobody thinks anymore because we have digitalization and we have artificial intelligence. So just give it to artificial intelligence and they will do the calculation to everything. And as recent studies show, artificial intelligence is very affirmative. If you say we have to get rid of the foreigners, then ChatGPT or whatever finds an argument that it's correct to get rid of them.
Yes, yes.
So, especially in terms of our position as academics, as intellectuals, what is our role, the challenge for us really to maintain thinking?
This was interestingly, before we had this meeting, we had our department session meeting, and the topic was the use of artificial intelligence in examinations, because we had the final examinations, and a lot of teachers were suspicious that students used artificial intelligence, but I don't know. This was told to me, ChatGPT you can, I think, control, you can find out, but new forms of artificial intelligence, you cannot prove it. This was today the topic of our meeting. How can we prevent it from being done? But I think nowadays is there really something we could do here? I don't know, Peter, really. I mean, it's more your topic, I think. What can we do more than to enlighten people about these things? I don't know what we can do.
What's about using it?
Using it, but then the problem is how much are we then personally artificially motivated? For example, if we are doing something with the help of these technologies, then we are, let's say, artificially, I will call it, we are artificially glorified by a digital technology, and maybe we are perceiving ourselves very wrong. So a sort of wrong consciousness will maybe happen. So we are writing very good things with the help, and we are then thinking more and more maybe, and this is a sort of alienation, that we have done it by ourselves. This is something I think about when I'm writing, for example. So it's very important to make a very good use of these technologies, but I really don't know how this can really happen. Or how can we limit ourselves in usage? We can only say, should the artificial intelligence write me a framework, and I will locate everything by myself, but will it be limited to this? This is the question, I think, which will...
Well, not directly linking it to the question of how to use it in the legal sector, but indirectly, if we talk about rights, if we really think about, if we are forcing ourselves, if we force others to think about what does it actually mean to have a right or not to have it, then it's something we hesitate, yes, look for a definition, and we do it. If I tell you what is the Declaration, Convention, or whatsoever, human rights, blah, 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 then you look for the document, take it, and you can report it. I read the other day about an interesting study about artificial intelligence. Actually, 3 groups had been asked to write an essay. The one using artificial intelligence, the one using a search engine, a well-known search engine, and the third one just using the head. It could not be seen immediately. This was written by artificial intelligence and. But what they said, comparing different essays, there hadn't been any innovative essay from artificial intelligence. They had been pretty soulless. There was no engagement.
Yes.
And after a while, it was actually pretty boring because they had been just repeating themselves.
But Peter, one critical...
Hang on.
Yes.
So, and then they asked, and this was with the engine, search engine was better, and just with the brain, it was innovative, it was strange and weird, but it was good. And then they asked, and this is where I think we can do something, we are challenged to do something. Now the people who did not use artificial intelligence or the search engine, now they are challenged to use it to improve their work.
Yes, I understand.
Part of this story was those who wrote it just using their head knew what they had been writing before. The others, they didn't know it. And I think in this way, it's a kind of training as well in law. Just ask people to think about what does it mean to have a right, to that a right is defined. What does it mean to talk about human rights and just rights in a contract area whatsoever, and then we can look for the paragraphs and articles to back it.
Yes, I understand you. I mean, I think you mean, I think, we should understand the functional dimension correctly, the functional dimension of this AI, and we should transfer this useful functionality to be located intellectually in our personal work. This would be an ideal situation. So, as you said, searching for documents and things by artificial intelligence, and then transferring it to something which then can be made by ourselves. Something like this. This is what I think it's very utopian, because you spoke about soullessness. So soulless things. So without soul, without impetus. But Peter, then I have to critique in general academy, let's say. Let's be provocative. If we are now looking to to a big part of academic articles, they are also very soulless without artificial intelligence even, because they are sometimes not more than reviews, text reviews or article reviews. So I think this is also a problem. And these people who are writing article reviews and are presenting them as big academic things, I mean, these people have certain limitations in general to make this understanding of AI in a correct way. So I think that the whole structure of the academy, I mean, it's utopian, has to be changed to come to the result to expect from AI, I would say.
Okay, I'm not against any radical change.
Yes, because I knew this, I have said this too.
and I have this comfort that Albert Einstein did not get the Nobel Prize on the first approach. I think it was the third or even the fourth when they said,
yes,
just get rid of him, give him the prize, and then he's out of the way. And there is.
But Peter, one moment, I interrupt you. What I like in your thing, this utopian side of AI, what you mentioned here, what I said seemed to be utopian. Even to think about this utopian side is good. So even if artificial has brought us to this thinking, to say it positive, it's a positive thing. So this is, for example, in itself a positive contribution.
Well, thank you, but I have to pass it on basically to, there are now, especially in the recent times, there are even from Apple research papers, they point out the limitation of artificial intelligence. I mentioned this article earlier where with the three groups. There is now an article I just read before we met on the limitations in terms of the used artificial intelligence. And in a way, I'm not overly optimistic, but I come back to this question of idealist, materialist, or materialist idealism.
Yes.
Where I think what you said as well, I would support this. We have to maintain this idealism, if you want, the utopian dimension.
Totally.
To say something we have to, and this is why we have this group as well. We have to move on, and even knowing that it is difficult, we shouldn't give up.
This is exactly, and the last thing I mentioned is exactly what you repeated now, what I wanted to say to you, and thank you, because I think this is exactly something which we should continue, and if AI even brings us components of the thinking, this is, as I said, in itself positive and something positively idealistic, I would say.
Okay, on this note, Mehmet Okyayuz, thank you very much.
This I thank you.
Conversation between two real people and not artificial intelligence. The voices have been real, and we continue on another level. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you also very much, Peter. Have a good time. Thank you.
Thank you.